Dance around the park, James, and don't spare the horses.
It's showtime.
All right, here we go. It is Thursday, the second day of April. The fools are in the rearview mirror, and let's get down to it. It's on the Ledger Ontario Politics podcast, and welcome in. And as we note, we record this thing on a Thursday morning, and so things may have changed by the time you hear this. And given the way things have gone over the last couple of weeks, that's not unlikely. So it's come to be expected. Around the table, Kathleen Wynne is here, former Premier of Ontario. Tim Hudak, former leader of the PC party, now at Council Public Affairs. John Wright, he is our resident pollster. We're going to get into some numbers that John released over the last couple of days just in terms of economic anxieties. And Keith Leslie, longtime observer at Queen's Park and former CP bureau chief at Queen's Park. Welcome in, everybody. We're heading into the Easter weekend, and I would like to think that we're going to get a change in the weather. A lot of anxiety around the weather. But just before we get to it, one of the things that sort of lifted the veil of anxiety, I think, was the Artemis launch this week. And Kathleen Wynne, it was just to watch it and see people so engaged and about things that are innovative and imaginative and creative, all of those things that we haven't really had a chance to celebrate. And given the current circumstances, it was a welcome salve, I think, for most people.
Absolutely. We were glued to it. And, I was 20 the last time we watched. I'm 73 now, so it was a long time ago. Very exciting. And I keep thinking, those people are up there, floating around, and wondering how they're doing, hoping they're okay. No, it was very, very cool. And, there were a couple of delays, and they were talking about it on the radio this morning, and I think there were like sharp intakes of breath. We want it to be okay. We want it to be okay. So just Godspeed. Just wish them all the best of luck.
Yeah, Tim, it's one of those things, where people stopped. They made an appointment. And when was the last time we all did that almost collectively? We made an appointment to stop and watch something together.
Yeah, we gathered the girls around. The dog joined us too. It is an exciting, awe-inspiring moment to behold, and makes you think, could I do that? Right? Could I take that chance? Could I be crammed into that small box for that many days? Would it be worth the experience of being that close to the moon, seeing Earth in the rear window, so to speak? Holy smokes! What an incredible! I mean, it's a great moment for all of us, but what an incredible moment most people as individuals to be so close you can practically touch them in.
Yeah, John, one of the things that was a highlight for us and our family was my grandson, who's 5.5, was thrilled at the prospect. And I'm glad that it happened so that he could watch it at home with mom and dad. And he was so excited about it. And this is a kid who has the big book on the James Webb telescope. So he's thoroughly invested in this. To think, I was about that age when the Apollo mission started to really kind of take off. And I'm thinking, the effect that it has on a young brain like that in terms of just the possibilities, the excitement around it. It was really cool to see how excited he is about all this.
Well, I was 2.5 months old when Sputnik went into space. I was 10 when they landed on the moon. And during that time frame, I was one of those kids who built the Revel model Saturn V 5-foot rocket. I had the lunar module hanging from the ceiling along with the Gemini and the Mercury spacecraft. I even was in the Ontario Science Center fair where I put together a great big box and all the vermiculite was on there. It obviously had no impact on it had lots of impact on my ambition, but I had no talent to go into the Air Force or to do anything like that. But, there are milestones that you have in your own life. And if you go from the beginning to where we are today, I think one of the most impactful ones for me was Borman, Lovell, and Andersey. I remember the names in 1968 circled the moon for the first time, and it was at Christmas time, and they read Genesis. and the
Mm-hmm.
entire world stopped for a moment. And it was, I don't think you hear that today, but it was remarkable. But I think going back to what you're saying, Dave, space program will be captured by a lot of young people. They are going to be able to dream about going to the moon and things like that, because we're headed in that direction. Anything that empowers young people to go into STEM or to dream dreams, I think that's, outside of the technology that comes from these kind of missions, I think it manufactures dreams and ambitions, and I think that's great for all of us worldwide.
Yeah, Keith, when we were kids, my dad went out and got a map of the moon, and it must have been 4x4, and we put it up on the bedroom wall, and Dad put a mark on the map where the Tranquility Base would be, so we would know exactly where. So the fascination and the connection with that, and to Tim's point, though, when you realize that what they're sitting in is about the size of a minivan, it's a 10-day trip, 1.4 million miles, and you're thinking, holy cow, I'm complaining about the subway ride this morning,
I still remember the band Tranquility Base in Hamilton that played in our high schools. They were obviously named after that impacted so many areas of our lives, right? And it just the landing itself in 6 just inspired us. I was at that right age; it just clicked in with me. What I was a little bit disappointed in watching the takeoff yesterday, the Artemis II, because the countdown sort of stopped at 10 and they just let the events take over. I'm waiting for the full cut engines, go full blast. We wave liftoff of Artemis II on a mission to the moon. It's going to do this. None of that was there. They just treat it with the reverence it deserves. And I guess it's good they didn't talk over everything. And as they didn't, I just kept thinking, what must that feel like in your bones, that rocket, that riding that up like that, just it's got to be just incredible. The thrust, just feeling that going, your entire body, your eyes, everything just shaking so hard. But the inspiration it brings to all of us, I think, is really something. I did miss the countdown, the full countdown. I guess it's the way we're going to do these things from now on. I am looking back 50 years at these things, but I'm also, I was reminded as I watched this, and just, everybody just watching to that pinpoint just went so far off, they had to go to the animation, that when the Challenger blew up, CNN had gone to commercial because these takeoffs had become so routine.
Wow.
So it's good that this inspires us all, that everybody's back staring, waiting, making this an event for the world to watch. And I think basically all around the world, people are watching this thing to see, and it's inspiring to everyone. And the fact they have a Canadian on there, what a bonus. What a bonus.
And they're so brave, hey? I mean, it's so brave to do this. Apparently Jeremy Hansen has told his family told his parents or his family that, he might not come back. He knows that. And just to step into that capsule and to go into, I mean, I know there's a lot of it that's more known, but it's the unknown, folks. Like, you're going out there and who the heck knows what you're going to encounter. So it just takes a lot of nerve. I don't ever think, would I want to do that? Because I know for sure I wouldn't. But it's so great that there are people who do, and that people who think about that, Dave. That you might have at one point wanted to do it. So, well, my hat's off to that kind of bravery.
In the studio, I've got a framed mission patch from Chris Hadfield that he gave me years ago, and one of the most impressive people I ever met was Roberta Bondar.
Fantastic.
There, I realized, we weren't going to the moon, but our Canadian representation in terms of the space agency and the space missions really well represented. And what greater rock star in the space agency was there than Chris Hadfield, right? So I think.
Well, and I remember when he was there, and I guess I was premier. Anyway, the Science Center was in my riding, and he was singing. It was Music Monday, and he was singing from the space station. I was there with a whole lot of kids in the Science Center, and it was very cool. But they are a special breed of people like Roberta Bondar and Hatfield, Marc Garneau, who have that, whatever it is, that je ne sais quoi that allows them to feel that they can do it. So it's wonderful.
Yeah. Well, and Julie Payette might be the outlier there, right? Just in terms of.
Well, she was there. She was there.
I know she was there.
Yes,
It's just in terms of that character quality or the personality or whatever it was. It was kind of a
Did you see
departure, we'll call it.
Did you see William Shatner was doing interviews about this?
Yes.
Was he really?
Was he?
Absolutely. Yeah,
Oh,
yeah.
right on. Well, he's
God
been up
bless him.
there.
Great. Love to meet him. One of my heroes growing up, Captain James T.
Oh.
Kirk. I wasn't an astronaut. I played one on television in the movies. But here's what I have to say.
He was brave too.
Wait, he took on those Klingons?
Exactly.
That's it. Yeah. Speaking of extraordinary personalities, we learned this week of the passing of Stephen Lewis. And, I think a lot of people in this part of the world, Tim, looked at his record as a politician first and foremost, as the leader of the NDP here in Ontario, the leader of the official opposition during his career. But boy, I think you really limit your view of what Stephen Lewis contributed to the world, to Canada, to this province, if you just limit it to his time in the legislature. And I'm not saying that to diminish what he did with the NDP, or certainly as an MPP.
Yeah, a great leader, tremendous orator, inspiring, figure principled, clear where he stood. I learned most about Stephen Lewis through my grandfather, who was a hardcore CCFer, then NDP, always a lawn sign there. He was a union activist out of Petrolia, down by Sarnia, and he, adored the Lewis family, Stephen David Lewis. And if I followed the plot correctly, too, he passed away the day after his son Avi won the leadership in the Democrats.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's a pretty inspiring story, right there, sort of hanging on to see the third generation now, as a leader within the New Democrats. Iconic figure. We're less for his loss, but what a indelible imprint he made upon the province of Ontario and Canadian politics as a whole.
Yeah, John, we do some work with the IWK Foundation in Halifax, and it's all primarily we're focusing on women's health care. And there isn't a conversation that we have with the folks down there when his name doesn't come up in terms of, particularly his work in Africa and the grandmothers who cared for the kids whose parents were lost to AIDS and HIV.
Yeah, what a pioneering. So far out in front of things. And just to have heard him speak in that era. Now, I didn't see him obviously in the legislature. I was still in high school. But to hear him on the news, to hear him, even afterwards speak was spellbinding. Just an amazing orator. I thought it was very Hugh Segal when Mulroney was in the office for him to recommend that Stephen Lewis go to the United Nations, that he brought him in and was able to say, apartheid was really something that Mulroney should be doing something about. And so having that kind of an articulated voice in the United Nations really separated him from so many, because he was out in front of all the issues, which in many ways were so challenging at the time. So I think, he's we reflect for a day on Stephen Lewis, but his legacy will last for decades and decades. There's something fundamental about it. The only thing I would say, in having watched the NDP convention on the weekend, is that, it probably is a little more CCF than it was labor movement driven. But Lewis really brought them from just being labor movement driven into a different era where they were, going to different countries, where they were fighting for social justice and on other levels. So yeah, you could see his genetic imprint, not only with Avi Lewis winning, but also in the party itself.
Well, it was interesting, too, historically, Kathleen, when you look at when Stephen Lewis was the leader of the Ontario Party, his father was the leader of the Federal Party. And I recall the election might have been 72, I guess, and federally. And my uncle took me to a meeting. It was a rally for David Lewis in his riding. I think was he in York Weston? Was that his riding?
Mm.
And anyway, I was just a kid, fascinated listening to this guy speak up close, up front, and then you realize, okay, the genetic connection between the two of them and the ability to engage, the ability to communicate. all due respect to everybody around the table, we just don't see that as anymore.
No, no, not at all. And, he was a man of the world, eh? Like, to your point about the legislature, his reach was way, way beyond Ontario. And, I mean, whether it's apartheid or whether it was HIV, I mean, he made such a huge impact. And I'm not a particularly observant Christian, or observant religious person, but I believe he was hanging on till that election.
Yeah.
I think that he had a plan, and he wasn't going to go until he knew what was happening with Avi. And I think that one of the commentaries that I read talked about Stephen Lewis as not being afraid of anyone or anything. And I think that kind of, we're talking about courage, this is a totally different kind of awesome courage that this man had in the face of issues that he thought were wrong, things he thought needed to be changed. He didn't ever back down. He just kept on going. And I think he and Michelle Landsberg are a pretty formidable team. She doesn't get mentioned a lot, but that the family is super strong and principled. So I think it's a huge loss, but obviously he died knowing his son was the leader of the provincial NDP or the federal NDP, which there must have been a sort of ray of happiness for him. And I will just say, I know this is more political, but I think we have to be careful as a commentariat not to underestimate Avi Lewis, just given that DNA.
Fair point.
I was going to say that, Keith, in as much as, if you look at the new chapter for the NDP under a Lewis banner, it's almost to a point when we've all kind of commented on this previously in terms of the state of the New Democratic Party federally. It's broken, and it needs to be reset and recalibrated. So if nothing else, if Avi Lewis is a risky choice for the NDP, then there probably really wasn't any other way to kind of fix it rather than to have a really disruptive, individual at the helm. And he seems to be the guy. Whether you agree with what he's going to do or not, whether he's going to attract anybody, he's probably what the party needs in an odd way.
Well, I suppose there's one way of looking at that he could be the savior in the turnaround. But the obvious thing is that basically he's become the leader of the federal NDP at a time when they're just cratering him, 6-7% in the polls. And the two places, British Columbia, the premier there wants nothing to do with him, the NDP premier there. The New Democrats in Alberta want nothing to do with him. They're talking about separating. Right now, if you join the federal or provincial, they're linked in the New Democrats, unlike the other parties. Alberta's NDP wants to separate. Nancy wants nothing to do with Avi Lewis. So he's got some major hurdles here to overcome. I wasn't at the legislature either when Stephen Lewis was in there, but I did cover a couple of his speeches later. And man, they talk about oratory skills. He was simply unbelievable. Him and Ian Scott always rank in my mind as people that could just talk forever, and I would sit there and listen forever because they had so much to say. Stephen Lewis, again, tackling the huge issues of his time, of our times, apartheid and AIDS. And, tackling AIDS when it wasn't at all an easy or popular thing to do. He was out there forefront fighting that battle. And on apartheid, I read one thing, I'm sure you guys probably did too, there was so much written about him in the weekend, where he actually rewrote Brian Mulroney's speech on apartheid to the United Nations and said, Here, if you deliver this, you'll get a standing ovation. And of course, he did. And Mulroney became the real champion, the world champion on apartheid because of Stephen Lewis's guidance and prompting and his speech writing ability. So Avi's got quite large shoes to fill. He's got a huge challenge ahead of him. But I think Kathleen is right. Don't underestimate this guy. He's come from a long generation. His mom and dad alone, what they've contributed, and it's ingrained in him. So he knows what to do. He knows how to be controversial. He knows how to get attention. Does he know how to properly lead and bring people together? That's going to be his biggest challenge, especially with the BC and Alberta New Democrats really, really having issues with him.
Can I just say that my class on Monday, I just want to say my students on Monday, I think young people are going to look at this and to the disruptive point, I think they're going to be kind of excited about this. A lot of young people.
Well, and to that point, the constituency that he is appealing to are those whom we have identified on the other extreme and saying, I use that advisedly, but where people feel left out, right? And he's speaking to a demographic there, John, at least to say, what about me? And we can make as much fun as we want about some of the debate, such as it was that went on the floor of that convention and the things that they focused on. But overarching, most of those folks, their complaint was they felt that they had been left out.
Well, yes. I mean, but from a political perspective, I want to say this with the greatest respect. I mean, it was a cringy kind of fringe group gathering. There was no labor backbone to it as we would normally have seen. And as a result, you kind of look at who's watching the NDP there and in the future because their votes are going to count. I don't know how Avi Lewis is going to do. The party is broke. We don't have an election, anytime soon. I suppose the Prime Minister just wants to keep moving forward. He's in no rush to take a seat to be in the House of Commons. I'm not sure how he's going to connect with people across the country. And as you said, there are other political parts of that NDP equation that don't want to have anything to do with him. That's not a good starting point. If you are attracting and inspiring groups who are left out or young people, that's a small constituency, and you may end up with still the 8% that they've got or the 9%. I also wonder whether or not there will be others who are currently sitting who will be enticed to move over to the Liberals. So I'm a bit skeptical on the traction that this party's going to have. It's got a lot of baggage. It's got kind of a fringe group to it. I mean, Elizabeth May would be welcomed in a place like that because she's kind of on that end. So I don't know. I think in previous years where you would have had the Buzz Hargroves and you would have had, the labor backbone behind it, that's not what I witnessed this weekend. It's just not there. And it is a collective of people who are looking for a voice. And some of the things that they're talking about are not readily acceptable to the rest of the voters who are out there.
Yeah, I'm kind of the same wavelength as John here. I think back to my grandpa would not have liked third generation Lewis's policies because he's not talking enough about working families and raising wages, the affordability, and seems to be on some of the parts where I think seem dated. The anti-corporate rhetoric, I think his embrace of the more aggressive, green policies seems off to me. But look, here's a caveat, Dave. We're always lousy on one team picking who's going to be the best leader of another, right? We in the Conservative Party, we thought Senator Pupatella would beat Kathleen Wynne, and she ended up being a premier and getting, reelected as such because we saw probably the more blue candidate. And I bet you the Liberals thought that Christine Elliott would beat me and beat Doug Ford because it was the more, reddish candidate. So maybe we're all wrong. It just seems like he's got energy. No doubt, pretty clear. He seems to be a scrapper. That's all good. Just it sounds a bit dated to me. And my guess off where youth are today around, how they feel that they've been betrayed on what previous generations could accomplish.
I was on the Paul Martin campaign in 2005 when Buzz was there and put on a Liberal jacket. So the NDP lost the labor movement a long time ago.
Well, I was canvassing in both Scarborough Southwest and in University Rosedale on Tuesday in the federal by-elections. And in University Rosedale, the young woman who's the NDP candidate, her name's Serena Purdy, she has because she had old signs, she ran before, and so where the Jagmeet Singh name was, she's put on top of it, vote your values. And I have a theory that there's a cohort of NDP voters who voted for Carney, and they really didn't want Poilievre. They still don't want Poilievre. They would probably do that again in the identical circumstance. But I think we should watch those numbers because I came across a number of particularly women in the riding who are not particularly happy with with the direction that Carney has gone in terms of environmental issues, and sort of he's gone farther to the right than they're happy with. Not not diminishing the economic issues, and they would say that at the door, but they are more undecided than they were in the general election. And so I don't know what that will mean in terms of what Avi will mean to them in terms of their decision. But I think there's a bit more fluidity on that progressive left of center than maybe showing up in the polls yet. Just from my very, very brief sampling.
As we speak, the premier is in Texas trying to convince Republicans that, Canadians, we are likable folks and that tariffs don't work and all that the speech. I thought it was interesting. Marit Stiles accusing the premier of cosplay, going down there as Captain Canada again, but not really doing much for jobs. On the same day, we hear that Stellantis is considering the possibility of assembling Chinese vehicles at the Brampton site, John, and I understand the anxiety around that in terms of we talk about being disruptive, how disruptive this would be to the automotive industry. On the other side, we're at a place where I don't think we can ever go back to what the automotive industry and sector was like prior to Donald Trump. There has to be a recalibration here, and I don't know that the Chinese vehicles are the answer, but we have to be open to that possibility, and at least this sparks that conversation.
Well, sure. There's a few things, though. When I reflect on the price of gas at the pumps today, I also reflect on the fact that it's not going away. It's not going down anytime soon. Take a look and see that it was only a few months ago that we were at about $86 a barrel. It was 104 US yesterday. I think it's probably going to 150 or 60 US in the next couple of months. We're going to be faced with a few things. Number one is that the polling that was released this week showed that there's about 30% of the public who is already having to make significant changes to their lifestyle because of the cost of motor vehicles and other things. And that is going to ripple through. I mean, we can have a whole podcast just on the impact of what's happened here, because the wave of inflation is going to rip through the economy around the world in that supply chain is going to be remarkable. Even, the shortages of liquid helium for MRIs is going to happen. I mean, you're just looking out the window and you can see this wall of a wave coming at you. So, I mean, maybe it's going to be a situation that if there can be jobs created with the assembly of EVs, that the EVs, in fact, if they're at a low enough price, may in fact come during an era over the next 2 to 3 years, that it's acceptable, that people want to buy them. It goes back to, however, the discussion we had, I think it was like almost 5 months ago, and that was, if we don't have the infrastructure to deal with this stuff, and I know Mark Carney and the government has committed to doing something about that, well, then all of this is kind of for naught, because the United States is not going to accept, electric vehicles from China into their market, let alone anything else. So I guess I also heard Marit Stiles, talking about that it's only going to help if it comes to fruition. It's not going to help the 3,000 jobs that are there. It's and it's a kit being assembled and stuff like that. The reality is that anything that can create jobs, anything that creates an advantage for consumers, if we can do that, I think is something that is going to be seen as a very positive thing. But I don't think we're not taking into account what's about to take place in our economy, including the rising interest rates that are going to come as a result of all of this, the disruption it's going to be, in our own personal lives. I think yesterday I saw a report that said that if it comes to fruition over the next 2 years, it's going to take $17 billion worth of Canadian discretionary income out of the economy. Like just think about that for a moment. So we're on the precipice of a change over the next 2 to 3 years that from a supply chain and from an impact will be equivalent to what COVID was like in the first 2 years. So I think that this may be the beginning of something that's worthwhile, because it's coming into an era where Canadians are going to want to buy fuel-efficient cars, and it's not going to be mandated from the government. It'll simply be pocketbooks that are driving it.
Tim, I'm heading out to play music with the old boys tonight at the Galway Arms in at Queensway and Islington. So it's about a 29-kilometer
Nice.
drive. And I can get out there on a charge on the car. So I'm not putting any gas in there. But I'm more conscious of that today than I was 6 months ago, right? I mean, considering the costs. But
what's your opening number? Just curious. When the band
Yeah.
strikes up near the Galway, what's the opening song?
Oh, it depends
Is it
on who
Irish?
gets there first. Usually it's a Gordon Lightfoot tune, though. So the
Nice.
guys,
Okay.
kind of lend themselves into that. And to be clear, it's a sort of a jam session, informal, come as you are, and have good fun. But the whole question around the Stellantis project, on the one hand, we were all lamenting, oh my God, this is going to sit idle, and we're not going to be able to do anything with it. We're paying people for work that they're not doing based on the agreements. The premier promising we're going to put cars back in there. And that the first conversation, and again, it's a consideration that might happen. Everybody's pushing it back against it. I'm not sure that reflexively is the right answer, but anyway, I'd be curious to hear what you think.
Look, I'll take a hard position opposite my friend John on this. Look, I think it's better if it stays idle. Here's why, right? This is not surprising. It's entirely plausible. Stellantis is the weakest of the OEMs or the domestics, and the partnership kind of makes sense. This was called leap motor, leap engine, whatever, right? So it makes sense to do that. But what I worry about here is that this is going to be a sort of backdoor for heavily subsidized, cheap EVs that the Chinese government then uses to get into a market, expand the supply, shut down our existing domestic automakers, and then have a greater control over our foreign policy because it controls supply chain. I encourage Premier Ford to stay on the track that he's on, to oppose these types of things. And if President Carney insists on it, then there should be higher tariffs like the European Union is doing, and at least some mandate to manufacture parts here in the province of Ontario. Right? The notion of shipping these things in a box, heavily subsidized, is going to give them a competitive advantage in our marketplace. If you're a Honda, a Toyota, Hyundai, Ford, GM, you need to have, I think, 70% plus domestic parts, right? Because they're all CUSMA compliant for that trade. This will be exempt from that. So I think this could actually be cancerous to our auto sector as a whole under the current provisions of the deal, and good for Premier Ford in calling that out.
Yeah, I was going to say, Kathleen, we're sort of aiming at Ford and GM in terms of the big three in Stellantis. They're not really the big three anymore. I mean, it is Honda, it is Toyota, it's Hyundai.
Exactly.
Those are the Asian imports that are really having an effect. But to their credit, they're building and they're manufacturing here on this continent and in Canada. So I can see them being maybe even more upset than the North American companies.
Yeah, well, and I'm sitting just outside of Alliston, where the Honda plant is the anchor business in Alliston. Without Honda, Alliston's in big trouble, and so I think you're right. I mean, I think they must be looking at what exactly was this deal that was cut, and what are the requirements, because we don't know. We don't know what the conditions were. But I'm somewhere between Tim and John. I think in terms of we need to accept that there's going to be a major change, but I think we need to put conditions on what parts of it we will accept. And if I were sitting in the Premier's chair, I'd be saying, exactly what are the conditions that are going to allow for the production of materials that are going to be assembled, because we've had assembly plants forever in Ontario, but those vehicles that are being assembled with parts that are, that have a substantial amount of Canadian Ontario input in them. So I think that those are the questions we need to be asking. I mean, the Premier, as always, is a blunt instrument, so there's no nuance to what he's saying. So it's hard to get at what exactly are the issues. But I would love for us to know exactly what are the expectations that the Prime Minister has. Has there been that conversation between the Prime Minister and the Premier, and what are the possibilities? Is there a possibility that there can be some movement in terms of the requirements for Ontario manufacturing in those parts that are going to be assembled in that plant?
So, Keith, isn't this then just more or less an opening salvo in a much longer, complicated conversation about the future of our auto sector?
Absolutely. I don't know if it's the opening salvo. The salvos have been fired several times, I think, at this point. But it's absolutely. And the key question here, and my colleagues have all just discussed it, is it assembly versus manufacturing? I mean, an assembly plant, a manufacturing plant, that's something that Ontario desperately wants and needs and would be good for the economy, even if it is building Chinese cars, as long as, although, if they can become CUSMA compliant to some degree, maybe they won't shoot for the 70%. But if they do agree to manufacture parts in Ontario, in Canada, that's a huge improvement. That's a massive deal considering, as opposed to rather just assembling kits that basically come over and are assembled by robots. To Tim's point, though, we talk about the heavily subsidized Chinese electric vehicles. When Ford and Stellantis and them get $500 million, $1 billion from different levels of Canadian governments, can they not be accused of being subsidized as well? And they won't open a manufacturing plant without those investments. They will not open them without that. Is that not government it's corporate welfare, but is it not also, to some degree, a subsidy to those manufacturers?
It's a penny on the pound compared to what happens in China, right? Where it's an intentional government industrial policy to go into export markets, right? Increase market share and then eventually take them over. And I just don't trust the motivations of the Chinese government. But it's across the board, Keith, from its direct subsidies to low cost loans to government investment on a scale that makes that look like pennies that we did during any kind of restructuring here.
So their policy is predatory then.
Predatory.
It's an economic imperialism. That's how I see it. Yeah.
Okay.
So where does this go then? I mean, to John's point, the economy is going to be the economy. It's cloudy at best on the horizon, Tim, when we see what's coming. It's okay to say your ground. Boy, I mean, even John's numbers, when you start to look at how people were reacting to the price of gas, the cost of living, the anxiety around the uncertainty in the Middle East, all of this is coming to play, and people are worrying about jobs. So where do we strike the balance here?
Well, look, I'm always a fan of the school that you try to keep the cost of doing business down, right? So you have reliable and affordable energy prices. You make efforts to reduce red tape. You knock down interprovincial trade barriers. You try to keep the tax burden down. And, any kind of regulatory change should be done that you take out at least, one or two others for every one that you bring in at the end of the day. And if you need something in terms of shorter term stabilization, right, then I think that's fair. Accelerating, for example, investments in capital is very helpful. Some short term relief, until we get a deal with the U.S. But I'm not of the one that sort of jumps on the first ship passing. I do not believe that we should buy a ticket on the China, cruise ship and think that's going to be the rescue for our economy. I think the approach that Premier Ford has taken is the right one in dealing with this economic crisis. I'm not for one capitulating to the government demands out of China.
And Tim, I understand all of what you've said. I guess the question for me then is, what do you do with this plant and these people if the North Americans are not going to come and do anything? Secondly, this is a bigger play trade-wise because the deal was made in exchange for canola and things. Scott Moe was at the table, and Saskatchewan is going to benefit from this deal as well. Thirdly, I don't know where these vehicles are going to go. They may be kitted out, who knows, maybe shipped to Europe, maybe Mexico. I mean, we're producing these things. I just don't know what you put in that plant. So I'm more about the limitations that you have there and trying to make sure that Canada produces the skill set and the parts that we can compete in that market as opposed to simply take it and put it together and ship it. So I guess the question basically to everybody else here, what do you do with an empty plant with 3,000 workers who have nowhere to go? Do you penalize Stellantis or anybody and make them make something? Like I just don't know what you do with that. This is an opportunity to fill that space and to do things with it and keep people employed.
Right. And ultimately what we should be focusing on, and hopefully this is continuing, is solving the core problem here. And that's the trade instability, with the Americans, and whatever compromise needs to be reached to get more predictable access and lower tariffs. I think that's the ultimate goal, as opposed to targeting and making a compromise for one particular plan.
So I think there's a mix of transitional things that need to happen. So, John, to your point, in terms of the skill set, we have when we were dealing with this when I was premier, we would talk about residual manufacturing acumen. I mean, we've got a lot of fundamental skills in a highly educated workforce that are already here, but there's probably some upskilling that needs to happen. So I think as we sort out this, whatever this new deal is going to be with the United States, there is a training component that needs to happen, and people need to have access to those. We had a second careers program that that was specifically for people coming out of the manufacturing sector and being able to go to college and upskill. So I think we have to do that again, and we have to do it smartly for jobs that are actually going to be available. In terms of, as I said, the skill set, I think there are skills there, and maybe there's something else that can go into that plant that can use the skills that are available. If it's going to be a downsizing from 3,000 to 1,000 jobs, then there's going to have to be some kind of transition for those other 2,000 families, that are going to be without food on their table. And so on top of the training component, there's also going to have to be some kind of acknowledgement that those folks are going to need support. I mean, I don't know whether it's a CERB-like thing or a basic income or something that acknowledges that those people need to have a safety net as we go to whatever that new reality is. And I think we've made big mistakes over the years in terms of the free trade agreement, where we didn't acknowledge that. We saw people displaced and we didn't help them. We let them fall through the cracks. And I think that we can't do that again. So I think there needs to be a whole plan for catching people and acknowledging that while we go through that economic change that Tim is talking about, there needs to be government support, not just for the companies, but for the human beings who are living in those communities. The families of Ingersoll need to know that the government is going to support them.
We were looking at the headlines this week, and it was a rarity to see the municipal government, the provincial government, and the federal government all singing from the same hymnal this week, and that was over the development charges, $8.8 billion to cut them, and that is supposed to spur activity and make it more affordable in terms of housing. Tim, I'm curious just to get your top line read on that. Is that enough? I mean, this sounds just like, to be cynical, another announcement that isn't being backed up by shovels in the ground.
If it's not enough, I don't know what is. I'm really excited about the triumvirate of announcements around getting more homes built and getting affordability closer to hand for average Canadians. It's kind of the wish list. I remember championing all three at AREA. I'm happy that they're now coming into fruition and in a federal-provincial partnership to all the best. I had called a while ago for what I called a bit of an exaggerated term, but a Marshall Plan for housing to actually get more built, create more homeowners in our province. And I thought that was sensible, too, because it's not an export sector. So while we're having trouble on the trade front, especially the Americans, is there a domestic buoy that we can wrap our arms around and float in the sea, right? That will be creating Ontario-made jobs and help us through this rough patch. So I love it. This will basically reduce development charges in participating municipalities, federal provincial cost share by 50%. That's substantial. I mean, development charges can be up to $120K in some municipalities. So you're talking real money here. And in return, the municipalities will still get the revenue, right, for transit and roads and bridges and such. Number two, the HST relief, I think, was a huge announcement because it broadens it now to any home buyer of a new home, not just first-time home buyers. That will be a stimulus to the market as well. It's significant. And third, what's been rolled out this past week, also the notion of municipal corporations for water and wastewater. that can be up to a $60,000 charge in development. Instead, it'll be like a utility where it's spread out across users over time, not just the first buyer. Like that is a powerful 1, 2, 3 punch. Dave, that is going to do, it's hard to imagine a better combo of three things aside from giving away the houses for free.
So does that encourage developers then to put more shovels in the ground for new housing starts?
Yeah.
Okay.
Get more shovels in the ground, move development projects forward, but also bring demand to the marketplace with that HST relief, right? That's up to 13% to homes up to 1.5 million. And that's, I think, $130,000 in tax savings.
Yeah.
Am I correct in understanding that the legislation, though, will allow private corporations to run those water management companies? That they will not have to be public utilities. They could be managed, as you said, take the sewers and bridges or sewers and infrastructure, take the water management and hive it off.
So my understanding is
to be private.
Yeah, so I know that's a point that's being raised by QB and some others, but my understanding of the way the bill is crafted, and I could be proven wrong, but the way I was briefed on it is that it would stay in public hands. There would not be private sector investment in ownership of those utilities. They could keep those supply the debt financing, right? So if you need to borrow, you could borrow from OMERS, for example, or other pension funds and pay back the debt interest, but they would not get an ownership share.
They would remain public utilities and not private.
That's my understanding, exactly.
We saw in Great Britain, privatizing the water was just a disaster, a nightmare.
You're right on, Keith. Your research is good, right? In conversation with the government, that was a particular concern they had, and that's why they're not allowing private equity investment on the ownership side, but they will on the debt side.
Yeah, and I think at some point, Kathleen, when we look at the affordability issues, it had to be something swinging for the fences. And we've talked in the past, and it's certainly around our house, and one of the things that slows people down from buying and selling in Toronto is the double land transfer tax. Up against what Tim's talking about, it's actually considerably less than the development charges and the HST changes, but there are structural things there in terms of tax that really get in the way of making houses not just affordable but on the market, putting them on the market.
Yeah, and I mean, if this is a catalyst for the projects to go forward, I think that's a good thing. It's 3 years, that these are going to be lifted. So the question is, what happens after 3 years? And I think it's interesting that some of the northern commentators or northern mayors are saying, "Well, it doesn't help us. We already don't have development charges." So I think the devil will be in the details as it rolls out. But as I say, if this is a catalyst that actually gets projects to move forward, that's a really good thing. And this is spoken as someone who has been burned by the development industry. I remember having a conversation about 6-story buildings and, allowing them to use the new frame, the new wood that had been treated, and would they build, if we change the regulations, would they build 6-story buildings? And they said, oh yeah. I sat around a table with them. They promised, they said, yes, that would happen. They would build rental stock. Never happened. So we'll see. I'm going to withhold my applause, but I think if it's a catalyst, that's good, because there are projects that are sitting on the books that need to go forward.
So were those mass timber construction? Is that what it was?
Yeah.
And that we could do a whole show just on that and the benefits of using that in terms of safety and longevity and the environment. There's all kinds of reasons to do it. But anytime I ever talk to anybody about doing it, they would always come back, John, to the cost of doing business at that level, at scale, it was way too high. So whether it was interest rates or development charges or whatever, there was always an excuse.
Yeah, I guess so. I don't know what it takes to actually. Let me focus on something else, because we have young people within our own family who are now at the stage where they're looking at getting homes. So the question in my mind is whether or not all of this is going to make them buy, because you've got first-time home buyer programs, you've now got development you've got fees that are coming off. You've got infrastructure that is allowed to be put in place so that you can have municipalities exempt from certain costs. Like, I guess the question I have is when does this all come to fruition that will help people buy homes? And I don't know the answer to that right now. I know that my son is 33 years of age and still looking to buy his first home. And things, are getting to the point where you can see it on the horizon, but I don't know where we actually have, let alone shovels in the ground, an opportunity for people right now to actually take advantage of this. When you ask them where they want to buy, they're looking at secondhand condos, which have dropped 37% in the marketplace as opposed to a brand new house. And that's the thing, we talk about brand new houses that these opportunities are going to apply the exemptions to and all of the other bells and whistles. I don't know whether or not you can get anything that's going to be affordable for that group of people. It might be for me, might be for you to buy something like that. But I wonder how we trade this off with actual home buying as opposed to simply the incentives to put shovels in the ground to actually buy them. I mean, Tim, you're probably the one who's had the most experience with it. From when you take a look at this, I don't know what the market says in terms of how many people are going to take advantage of this as opposed to simply people who are like my age and say, well, I don't need a house that's brand new. So I don't know where that's coming. I don't know where it's going to come from at the moment.
It really is targeted at those types of buyers. For example, John, you've been very successful in life, so I think your price point is going to be higher than where this is in for the HST, right? So it is targeted more at the starter homes and move-up homes. What I like about the compromise that was reached where Ford moved Carney to his position was making it open to all buyers. So if, Deb and I were in our semi-detached and we bought a new home, that would open up the starter home for a young family, right? So that's a nice addition here. And certainly if the development charges relief goes through, and I believe it will, that sum is going to be most useful to people that are starting out in the housing marketplace and those who are already established, right? There's the value of that dollar is going to be much higher. So I'm confident. And Premier Wynne's point, I think the industry would love to comment on that because there has been in policies you brought in and for government, there was actually a significant increase in rental housing in the province. That was actually doing quite well. And I think largely our stall as it related to the overall economic situation, higher interest rates. This will help us get out of it. Last point, Dave, I'll come back on this. I'll put on my Keith Leslie hat on this one. But my understanding is there was some sort of compromise that happened between the federal and provincial government that initially Prime Minister Carney was opposed to the HST expansion like that. And the province put something else on the table. So I don't know if that's still to come, but if I have something to report back at the next broadcast, I'll let you know. But some grand bargain did occur.
Well, of course, as we often say at an unrelated news conference.
Oh, Chris. Almost drank your water. Did you have a sip of that?
I didn't touch it.
Okay, I'll take a sip. This isn't going to turn me into a liberal, is it? I've already been accused of being a liberal. Okay, sir. Well, they do accuse me. But anyways, here we go. Sorry, folks.
Well, given the way things have happened in Ottawa, I think Tim, the Prime Minister, would happily take Doug Ford into his caucus.
I just love those Doug moments, right? And so we've talked about some of them, and not everybody likes them. But the bee, the Crown Royal, now just good for him. Good humorous moment, self-deprecating humor that just warms up. And when you got to make tough calls, been there for a long time, the personal connection helps. And you can see it looked pretty natural with Carney beside him, and then Mayor Chow behind him, like they were having a good time. It actually looked like a genuine connection. Certainly, in the times that we face, the uncertainty we discussed earlier in the broadcast, to see the federal-provincial partnership, some compromises that are reached to go towards mutual goals, that is actually reassuring. And I think we're in a lot better place than we would be if we had wars between the federal and provincial level. So good for the Prime Minister and the Premier for finding that common ground, and the Mayor as well.
Before we go, I'm curious to get your take on this, Kathleen Wynne. Does residency matter when you're running in a riding?
Well, ask David Turnbull. When I was running in 2003, I would go to a door and he'd say, "Oh, or the person would come to the door and say, "Oh, you're the one who lives with her girlfriend outside the riding." So it was like a little wrap of homophobia and xenophobia all wrapped into one. I think it can matter. I was 14 houses out of the riding when I was running in Don Valley West first. I think in the situation in Scarborough Southwest, which is what you're talking about, I think that Nate Erskine-Smith has been so blatantly ambitious, and I think people see him as a carpetbagger, and I think it's about that, Dave, rather than the fact that he lives across the border of the riding. I think that's actually what it is. Kadira Jackson, who is, who's a candidate who's run for the nomination a couple of times and is well known in the community. I think she's just making the point that really, yes, it's about him living outside the riding, but it's more about why is this guy here? Does it have anything to do with the residents of Scarborough Southwest?
So you're not with Nate, I'm sensing. I just get a bit of a signal.
You're not planting the lawn sign.
No, I think that Nate has made a lot of mistakes in terms of trying to build a team. I don't think that's what he does, and I certainly don't think it's what he's doing now. To be calling up other candidates and asking them not to run, telling them not to run. It's just not what you do. Not if you're going to be the leader of the party.
Well, it's just getting nasty, Keith. I mean, already, and they haven't even kind of figured out how they're going to manage this in terms of who, if he wins, then he wants to take a shot at the Liberal leadership. So this is just a sort of a stepping stone. So I can see the arguments around the arrogance that's kind of baked into the campaign.
Well, he brought it on himself, didn't he? He's the one that complained the other candidate was living in London when they bought it, anyway. The whole thing is nonsense. It's nice inside dirty politics. It's lovely to see. I used to say it was always the Tories that were the best at the, stabbing each other in the front, but sometimes it's the Liberals. And it makes for entertaining, as a reporter, it's always good fun to cover these sorts of things. But it also shows the drive and ambition people feel. I mean, they really do get super invested in wanting to win. It's important to them. It's they feel they can make a difference, and sometimes they just get caught up in their own campaigning. And I think this was a case, one of many, where Erskine-Smith has just went a step too far, and it backfired on him. And it points out, he's not actually in the right. Carpetbagger, perhaps a really good description.
Just before we go, John, I want your read on the liaison poll that was out today, showing a 3-point difference between the Liberals, the leaderless Liberals, and the Conservatives, and against the backdrop of what's going on with Nate Erskine-Smith and his ambitions. I just wonder what kind of is bubbling under the surface in all of this, because if the Liberals are looking at it thinking, wow, we got a shot, we don't even have a leader, does that improve or decline if we anoint Nate Erskine-Smith as the leader of the Liberals?
Let me be a poll doctor for a moment, a physician. Let me look at the chart. Pull the chart out.
Yep.
Top line. Well, you're Mr. Ford. You're doing okay. Top line. Underneath, all of the approval ratings for everything underneath, except for Captain Canada. There's a corrosive problem within the body. There's no question about that. That there's no one to seize upon it, and as a result, it's just festering. The third thing is that I think we have to look at the rise in the blood pressure for the Liberals, is that that's coming from another source. It's likely outside of the body, where you've got Mark Carney, which is pumping all of that up, and it's not helping. The NDP, in fact, are standing still and not really going anywhere. I guess the last point is that if there's going to be an agent introduced into the body politic, and it's going to be Nate Erskine-Smith, most people, the vast majority of people will not know anything about which we are talking about today. Nothing. And so if he gets into that stepping stone, we all know that then it's not necessarily a matter of personality. It's about how many memberships you sell. Right? So that's another thing. I would just say that if there is a prescription for all of this, I go back to two things. Number one is we still have at least another 2.5 years to go before an election. So he's still, the premier still got lots of time. The question in my mind is whether or not we're getting too much of the premier, and whether or not there should be, he wears everything. He's out there. And yes, he's funny sometimes, but he He's constantly in our faces, and it is it's a little concerning that the legacy is really about bricks and mortar in downtown Toronto as opposed to some of the bigger issues. So I think that's my pronouncement at the moment. It's an interesting poll, but I think Mark Carney's Liberals are buoying up the Liberals as opposed to anybody doing anything substantive to move in that direction.
And just to the corrosion in the body, John, the numbers on how people feel about the freedom of information request, people who would never in their lives make a freedom of information request don't like that the government is trying to tighten up on information that goes out. Reporting on hallway medicine, that they're not going to do that anymore. 40 vice principals being laid off in the Toronto District School Board. Those kinds of actions they're going to cause trouble. They are already causing trouble for the government because that's not what he's paying attention to. He's paying attention to being folksy and, doing what he does at the podium. That's why he likes to be at the podium, because he can interact with the media in that way. And he gets good press on that. But what's going on the ground is affecting people's lives, and a lot of it they just don't like.
Well, I expect we'll see more podium appearances next week, because I think the legislature is not sitting next week as a result of the Easter. It's like 2 weeks on, 1 week off, 2 weeks on. Did I get that right, Keith? Is that how it's the rhythm? Yeah.
It's a tough
right
rhythm,
until
but
the end of June.
it.
So, yeah, it's all good. All right, well, we'll leave it there for this week. Thanks for joining us. We hope you all have had an enjoyable Easter break, and we'll get back at it next week here on The Ledge. Kathleen Wynne, Tim Hudak, John Wright, Keith Leslie, all here around the table for On the Ledge, your Ontario Politics podcast. I'm Dave Trafford. Enjoy your long holiday weekend.
Pay no attention to that man behind the curtain.